The girl came out of the west at sundown, riding a tired bay mare through dust that burned gold in the dying light. Her hat pulled low, her spine straight, and a question heavy as a saddlebag beating in her chest. She had crossed 3 territories, asking the same thing in towns that smelled of whiskey and regret. Had you seen a man named Eli Mercer? Tall once, dark-haired once, eyes like a storm that never quite broke. Most folks shook their heads, some spat, a few laughed, and one old woman finally pointed east and said, "If he's alive, he's hiding where men go to be forgotten." That was how the girl found herself riding toward Red Hollow, a place scratched into the land like an old scar, where the wind never rested, and neither did the ghosts. Her name was Clara Mercer, though she hadn't used the last name much growing up. Names were dangerous things when you were raised on the run. Her mother had told stories in pieces, careful ones, about a man who could break horses and fix clocks, a man who left before trouble found him, or maybe because it already had. Clara never knew which version was true, only that her mother died with his name half-spoken, and that left Clara with a promise she couldn't bury: find him, look him in the eye, and decide whether the hole in her life was his fault, or just the way the world worked. Red Hollow announced itself with silence. No dogs barking, no children shouting, just the creak of a loose sign and the groan of a windmill that had forgotten its job. The buildings leaned like old men sharing secrets. Clara swung down from her horse and felt every mile in her legs. She tied the reins and stood there a moment, breathing in dust and iron, watching a single man step out of the largest building, a boarding house by the look of it. He moved slow, like each step had to be negotiated. His shoulders were broad but bent, his beard grey and wild, and when he looked up, his eyes caught the light, sharp, wary. Tired in a way that went past sleep, he watched her the way men watch storms on the horizon, knowing they might pass but preparing for damage. Clara met his stare and felt something twist, not recognition, but gravity, as if the space between them had weight. She asked him where she could find Eli Mercer, and for a flicker of a second the man flinched, just enough to give himself away. Then he shrugged and said she was asking about ghosts, and ghosts didn't like being found. His voice was rough, worn thin by years of silence. Clara thanked him anyway, but she marked that flinch, tucked it away like a bullet in her pocket. The man was named Jonah Reed, though that name wasn't the one that echoed in his head when the girl said Eli Mercer. Jonah ran the boarding house, if you could call it that. He took in drifters, broken men, and the occasional widow with nowhere else to go. He fixed what could be fixed: boards, roofs, sometimes people, and buried the rest. He told himself he liked the quiet, that Red Hollow suited him, but the truth was quieter still. He stayed because leaving meant facing the things he had done and the ones he hadn't been brave enough to do. From the window of his office, Jonah watched the girl settle her horse and step inside the general store. He saw the way she moved, careful but not afraid, like someone who had learned early that fear didn't stop bullets. Something about her scraped against him, maybe the set of her jaw, maybe the way she held herself like she expected disappointment and planned to survive it. Jonah poured himself coffee that had been sitting too long and tasted bitter regret instead. He told himself she'd leave by morning. They always did. People came to Red Hollow to hide or to die, not to build anything new. Clara spent the evening asking questions. The shopkeeper pretended not to hear. The saloon keeper said he didn't remember yesterday, let alone years ago, and a miner with hands like stone told her that Mercer was a cursed name around here, that men with that name brought fire in graves. Clara listened, nodded, paid for her meal, and said nothing, but inside she felt the truth pulling tighter, like reins in a hard hand. She rented a small room at the boarding house, and when Jonah handed her the key, their fingers brushed. A spark of something sharp and unwelcome passed between them. He looked at her too long, and she wondered if he already knew who she was that night. Red Hollow dreamed uneasily. The wind rattled the windows, and Jonah sat awake in his chair, staring at the wall where a faded photograph hung crooked. A woman with dark hair, a baby on her hip, and a man standing a little apart, his face half turned away. Jonah hadn't looked at that picture in years, but tonight it felt louder than the wind, louder than the past he tried to bury under work and dust. In the small room upstairs, Clara lay awake too, staring at the ceiling, whispering her mother's name like a prayer. Neither of them slept, and neither of them yet understood that by morning the question of a father would turn into something far more dangerous. the need for a family where none was supposed to exist. Morning came hard to Reed Hollow, the sun lifting like a reluctant promise over roofs warped by heat and years. Clara rose early, pulled on her boots, and went downstairs where the smell of burnt coffee and frying salt pork clung to the air. Jonah was already awake, seated at the long table with a ledger open before him. Though his eyes weren't on the page, they followed her the moment she entered, cautious, measuring, like a man tracking something he feared to name. She greeted him, polite but firm, asked again about Eli Mercer, and this time Jonah didn't deflect, didn't joke, didn't pretend. He closed the ledger slow and said some names carried consequences, and asking after them was a good way to invite trouble that didn't care who got hurt. Clara told him she wasn't afraid of trouble, said she'd been living with it since childhood. Jonah studied her then, really looked at the line of stubbornness around her mouth, the shadow of grief she wore like a second skin. He asked who she was to Mercer, and she answered plain, "I'm his daughter." The word landed between them heavy as a dropped anvil. Jonah's chair scraped back as he stood, color draining from his face. For a moment Clara thought he might deny it, but instead he turned away, ran a hand through his beard, and laughed once, a broken sound with no humor in it. He said the past had a cruel sense of timing, and that Red Hollow was a poor place for reunions. Jonah finally told her what the town wouldn't. Years ago, Eli Mercer had ridden into Red Hollow with a pocket full of plans and a head full of fire. He was smart, dangerous in the way men get when they believe they can outthink fate. He'd crossed a railroad syndicate, taken money that wasn't his, and tried to disappear. But men like that don't vanish clean. They leave blood behind. When the syndicate came calling, Eli ran, left everything, including a woman and a child. Jonah's voice roughened when he said that part, as if each word dragged something raw across his throat. Clara listened, fists clenched, the story fitting too well with what her mother never finished saying. She asked where Eli was now. Jonah didn't answer right away. He went to the window, watched dust spiral along the street, and said some men don't get where they're going. They just stop running. He told her Eli had died 3 winters back, fever and a bad wound, buried outside town under a mesquite tree with no marker. Clara felt the room tilt. Grief hit her sideways, sharp and unfair. She hadn't come all this way for a grave. She wanted answers with breath still in them. Jonah offered to take her to the grave later, his voice low, almost gentle. And that gentleness unsettled her more than the truth. Clara stayed. Days turned, slow and uneasy. She helped in the kitchen, listened to the stories of men who had lost everything worth naming. She learned Red Hollow was less a town than a pause in the world, where lives caught and waited. Jonah watched her find her place with a mix of relief and dread. She brought light without meaning to, asked questions that made men remember they were human, and Jonah felt something he hadn't allowed himself in years. Responsibility that went beyond keeping a roof from falling in. When Clara laughed, it echoed down the halls and stirred something buried in him, something dangerously close to hope. Trouble arrived on the 4th day. It rode in wearing fine coats and hard smiles. 3 men bearing the mark of the railroad syndicate. They dismounted like they owned the ground, asked questions with voices too polite to be honest. Jonah knew them the moment he saw them. The past, stepping out of the sun. They were looking for unfinished business, a ledger, money, names, and when they asked about Eli Mercer, Jonah lied without blinking, said the man was long gone and useless to them. Clara stood behind him, silent, sensing the shift in the air, her hand drifting toward the knife she kept in her boot that night. Jonah told Clara the rest, the part he'd hoped to carry alone. Eli Mercer hadn't just been a drifter or a thief. He'd been Jonah's brother, blood-bound and broken together. Jonah had stayed behind to clean up the wreckage, to make sure the syndicate never found what they were looking for. He confessed that protecting Red Hollow had been his penance. Clara absorbed the truth in stunned quiet, anger flaring hot and sudden, not just at Eli, but at Jonah too, for knowing, for staying silent, for deciding what truths she deserved. Jonah accepted her fury without defense, said she had every right to hate him in the days that followed. The syndicate men lingered, their presence poisoning the air. Clara realized Red Hollow was no longer just a stop on her journey. It was a battleground she'd been dragged into by blood and choices made before she was born. Jonah began preparing, checking rifles, securing doors, making plans he prayed he wouldn't need, and somewhere between shared meals and shared fears, Clara saw the man beneath the guilt, a man who stayed when others ran, who carried burdens not because he had to, but because no one else would. She didn't forgive him yet, but something inside her shifted. The space she'd meant for a father began to fill with something unexpected. The possibility of a different kind of family, forged not by birth, but by standing your ground. When the past came riding back into town, the wind changed on the seventh day, blowing hard from the south, carrying grit and warning in equal measure. Jonah felt it in his bones before the first shot ever cracked the air. The syndicate men had decided Red Hollow was done waiting. They came at dusk, spreading out through the town like a slow sickness. Rifles low, confidence high. Clara stood beside Jonah on the boarding house porch, the sky bruised purple and red behind them, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she wasn't thinking about the father she'd lost. She was thinking about the man beside her, the one who had chosen to stay. The shooting was quick and ugly. No heroics, no speeches, just smoke, noise, and fear moving faster than thought. Jonah moved with a steadiness that came from years of regret, not bravery. He covered the windows, shouted orders to the men inside, and trusted Clara without question. She proved worthy of that trust, her aim clean, her hands steady, the lessons learned on the road paying their debt. When one of the syndicate men fell in the street, the sound echoed like a door finally slamming shut on the past. It ended as suddenly as it began. 2 men dead, one riding hard for the horizon. The town breathing again in shaken gulps. Red Hollow stood scarred but standing, as it always had. Jonah sat on the porch steps afterward, blood on his sleeve that wasn't his, staring at nothing. Clara knelt beside him. Her anger burned out, leaving something quieter and stronger behind. She realized then that the hole in her life hadn't been waiting for her father. It had been waiting for someone who would choose her. Even when it cost them something, they buried the dead at sunrise. No names spoken, no prayers offered, just work that needed doing. Afterward, Jonah took Clara to the mesquite tree, the one twisted by wind and time. He showed her the unmarked grave, said he was sorry for everything he hadn't said sooner. Clara stood there a long time, then placed a stone at the foot of the tree, not for the man Eli had been, but for the end of the chase. She felt lighter leaving that place than she ever had riding toward it. Clara told Jonah she wasn't staying because she had nowhere else to go. She stayed because she wanted to. Red Hollow needed mending, and so did she. Jonah didn't argue, didn't ask her to fill a space she wasn't offering. He simply nodded, eyes bright with something that might have been gratitude or grace. The boarding house began to change in small ways. Laughter more common, repairs made with care instead of habit. Men who had been hiding started to live again. Seasons passed. Dust gave way to rain, and rain to green shoots along the hollow. Clara learned the rhythms of the place, and Jonah learned how to be more than a keeper of ruins. They worked side by side, not as blood, but as choice. When people asked who she was to him, Jonah said she was family, and for the first time the word didn't feel like a lie. Clara never stopped missing her mother, never pretended the past hadn't shaped her, but she stopped letting it define her. She found strength not in what she'd lost, but in what she'd built. Jonah watched her grow into herself, with a quiet pride that surprised him. He realized that being a father wasn't about the beginning of a life. It was about showing up for the rest of it long after the syndicate was forgotten and Red Hollow found its place on the map. Travelers spoke of a boarding house run by a grey-bearded man and a woman with steady eyes, a place where broken things were welcome and staying was a choice. Clara Mercer had come looking for her father, and found instead a man who needed a daughter more than she needed a dad, and in that exchange, both of them finally came home.